This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
I'm your host, Adam Zuckerman, and today we have a very special guest, Tim Clifford. Tim's career began on the bustling floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in the 1980s, where he started as a runner and then a trader and gained a solid foundation in financial markets. In the 1990s, he joined Charles Schwab & Co., where his interactions with financially successful clients revealed the crucial difference between high earners and true wealth accumulators, shifting his focus from trading to wealth management. By the 2000s, Timothy had advanced into leadership roles, driven by his passion to help others build and manage their wealth. In 2012, he became a certified financial planner and founded Core Wealth Consultants in Central Florida. One of his significant achievements is the creation of Plan Assist, which we're here to talk to you about today, which is a tool designed to simplify wealth building for those who need help with prioritization and organization. We're thrilled to have Tim on the show today to share his expertise and his insights on financial planning, decision-making, and how these aspects integrate into comprehensive estate planning and even end-of-life task simplification. Tim, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great that you're here. So let's start off with a few quick questions and then we'll dive in. Tell us a little bit about your early days at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange floor and how that experience shaped your understanding of financial markets.
So I was one of those 70s babies, grew up basically with no money and was trying to figure out the fastest way from having no money to having a lot of money and without going to college, right? So it was like this, how do I do this shortcut? I grew up in central Indiana, and in kind of back in those days, the fastest way to it was go to Chicago and trade commodities. So I'm like, I'm in. So I moved to Chicago and got into the commodity business and found out that was a lot harder than it kind of sounded and looked from the outside. But once I was in, I worked my way through it, had a variety of different roles. But it became really obvious after spending almost a decade in the commodity business that this wasn't going to be a good path for me to accumulate wealth. I'd make a lot of money and I'd lose a lot of money. And I'm like, this isn't working, or it doesn't seem to be working kind of long term. So I shifted my focus from basically trading commodities to working for Schwab and working in the stocks and bonds and mutual fund industry. So that was kind of my early days and kind of how I got, into the brokerage and financial planning business.
So you hopped in, you have the exposure from being on the floor. It's a meat grinder over there. You switch over to wealth planning for individuals. What led you to lead Schwab and then create Core Wealth Consultants? And how is that a different approach for you?
When I went to Schwab, this is the 90s. You really didn't have financial planners back then. It's almost hard for people to believe that industry, it did exist small, but very small. For the most part, those of us in the business were more stockbrokers. I mean, so we'd call you up and say, you need to buy this stock, sell this stock, buy this mutual fund, sell this mutual fund. So it was more transaction focused and more just, and at Schwab, it was even more customer service focused, like helping people with kind of doing stuff. But what transitioned me from Schwab into kind of a leadership position was, even before I got into the leadership position, what became my aha moment of where I am today at Schwab was, as I worked with hundreds and hundreds of clients, it became really clear to me that clients that made a lot of money made different decisions than clients that had a lot of money. And though people that had a lot of money made a lot of money, but there was a massive difference between that. And it was very difficult to see unless you worked at a company like Schwab or Fidelity or TD Ameritrade, because when you live in a typical town where I was at in Indianapolis, there were lots and lots of little towns and communities that all looked the same. People drove the same cars, had the same houses, sent their kids to the same college, same schools, all that kind of stuff. But when you worked at Schwab, it became really obvious that this zip code of people really had a lot of money, very different than what another zip code had. And so really that started me down this journey of, okay, what am I going to do here with this information? And so I kind of ended up in kind of more a leadership management role. And then it became obvious I wanted to kind of go build something that made a little bit more of a difference in people's lives.
I'm curious about that. So you say that people that have a lot of money, they approach things differently. What do you mean by that? And do you think that's learned, or do you think it's inherent somehow somewhere else? So they have that approach because of it. Is it causation or correlation?
I think it's a little of both. And I don't think it's obvious. I think it's much more difficult to explain. And I think it's a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, if you take a couple, right? I mean, so you sit down with a husband and wife, one might have a little bit different. So when you're on kind of a team, husband, wife, or, significant other, even then the decisions become different. But those decisions are they're minor decision to decision, but the combination of those decisions make a huge difference at the end of 20 or 25 years. It's why you and I both know people that made tons of money for 10, 15 years and they're retiring. And yet, okay, again, this isn't about, I'm going to retire with no money. That's really not the point. It's you retire good or you retire great, right? You retire okay or you retire with no issues at all. It's more of that than it is, retire and live on the streets with no money. I'm not actually even talking about that. But the difference between that person that retires good and retires great, it's combination of dozens of decisions over time. And I think it is learned and intuitive. So I don't
Let's
think it's a
let's talk about some of those specific decisions. So give a few examples of what you think somebody that is preparing properly versus someone who is potentially has a bit of room for improvement follows. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about how that incorporates into Plan Assist.
kind of first and foremost, and we'll probably get to this, so I might be jumping ahead a minute, but first and foremost, people have to live within their means, right? I mean, the single biggest mistake people make is living outside their means, but that's easy to do early on in your career. And if you don't get that under control really quick, because it's really a mindset and it's a habit, and it's kind of this whole overarching kind of process, because if you don't get it under control early in your life, it will carry through as you make more and more money, and it will impact your financial success as far as how much you put in your 401k. So just as an example on this call, to keep it relatively short, is putting money in a 401k. Someone that's 30 years old, they're like, the company matches 4%. I'm putting 4% in. Well, you can put $20,000 in, right? It's not 4%. It's how much can I put in? It's not just what company matches.
Yeah. My father, who was at the IRS, it was one of the first things he told me when I got my first full-time job was maximize your 401k, get the match where it is, and pay yourself first before everybody else. So I think that you're onto something there.
That's great advice.
In terms of living within your means, it's a great framework that it should just make sense to people. But what does that actually mean? How do you ensure that you're living within your means? Is there a point where you say, this is what I make, and I back in that this amount goes to this and this goes to that? Because it's difficult for people to take a framework and actually apply it. So let's talk about application.
Living within your means early in your career is difficult because you're buying a car, you're buying a house, you're starting to have a family. There's just a combination of life events that cause living within your means difficult. But at the same time, you do have to make sure that you still have to do it. And the way that I have found the best way to do it is to be really clear on kind of what you're not going to do, not what you're going to do. And then kind of whatever, as you start making money, you need to spend a decade living. So you're going to probably spend a decade. This would be a typical, and again, I'm overgeneralizing, but it gives you a sense of pretty common. First decade working, you're probably overspending. Second decade, you're spending kind of, now you need to actually underspend, right? Because you have to make up for the overspending. Did you see what I mean? And then the third decade is when you actually start saving money. That's why you see people in their 40s and 50s, their net worth will go from basically zero to 400, 500, 600 million, $2 million, right? But it doesn't happen in like a year or two. It happens kind of over, say, 3 decades. It's overspend, underspend, but make up for the overspending for a decade, and then save just enormous amounts of money. But those habits will carry through each of those decades.
And is that the roadmap that Plan Assist is helping people put in place as they go through the different phases of their employment and wealth growth journey?
So once I became a financial advisor, I have about 50 households and $30 million. So relatively small solo practice financial
Mhm.
advisory business. But I really noticed after I'd been doing this for about 5 or 6 years that there were some really basic principles that I needed to drive home to my specific clients. And so that's kind of where Plan Assist got born. And what I found was there was three basic processes that people with money follow that people that make money typically don't, okay? Or they don't at the same discipline that the people with money. And they'll call them different things. So I think that's important to kind of point out. So the words I use may be used differently or words you'll hear them talk, but I've not sat down with someone who makes a lot of money that don't have a plan. They
Mhm.
almost all have a plan. They all are diversified. And then people with money, which that people without money or just make money do terribly, is they seek counsel. And
Mhm.
so I kind of put this framework together and I did it at 20 or 30,000 feet because I find that when I really sit down with clients, you have to personalize it and everything gets different. So the booklet, it's only 50 pages. This isn't like one of those how to get into detail like your program gets into. Tell us the exact account number, how
Mhm.
that account's titled, where the beneficiary is. All that's fantastic and part of putting a plan together. But what I try to do in Plan Assist is keep it relatively high and then let people personalize it. So to have a plan may be as simple in the beginning as I'm here and I want to go there, right? And maybe a
Mhm.
here there plan, right? We have this and assets making this much money and we want to go here in the next 12 months, 24 months, whatever that is.
So,
So that's where it
so
kind of comes from and what it is.
so step one is create that plan. It doesn't need to be complicated, but you have to start
Right.
somewhere. So step two is get diversified. What does that mean?
So diversification, as you get into that kind of 10-year window of retirement, diversification is more complicated than what a lot of people think. It's not just diversifying across investments, though that's part of it and a big part of it. So having U.S. stocks, international stocks, having small cap, mid cap, all those types of things. That's important. But equally important is being diversified across assets, but also you need to be diversified across income. So as you get into retirement, you need to go into retirement with multiple income streams. And then
Mhm.
finally, you need to be diversified across tax liability. So you need to have a taxable, tax deferred, and tax free type of accounts. So as you get into retirement, you can manage your taxes with a little more purpose, I guess, is the,
Mhm.
or awareness is maybe a better way to word it.
And I think that might lead us to the third step, seek counsel. I think that the majority of people, when they are growing and starting off on their journey, unless they are focused on financial planning, on tax planning, they don't know about deferred compensation. They don't know about the tax havens that people might seek out and have options to take advantage of. How do people start learning? How do people find counsel so they know what is appropriate for them? Because they're unique, just like everybody else, and their
Correct.
situations are going to require individualization and customization.
So this was the one that was the most surprising to me. And I mean, like, it was borderline shocking because as I did it, I've always talked and worked with clients that seek counsel, right? So my job has always been help rich people get richer or hold on
Mhm.
to their money. I mean, for all practical purposes, right? Because people that didn't seek counsel didn't call me. And so I didn't really engage with that particular group
Mhm. Mhm.
of people. But as I started doing the research and as I started digging into it, I'm like, oh my gosh, there are millions and millions of people that don't seek counsel, don't know how to seek counsel, and almost don't even understand it. And what I mean, and so what I did was, and again, I'm oversimplifying this for the podcast and for the books. So when you sit down, but I found there's two kinds of counsel. There's informal counsel and
Mhm.
there's formal counsel. Okay, now think of informal counsel as everything where people just tell you it's your brother-in-law, it's your neighbor. It's basically it's YouTube. Okay. It's important to understand even YouTube has lots and lots of information, But YouTube pays 2 and 3 times more money for a financial channel than it does, say, a how-to channel. So there's people seeking advice on there. That's all informal. Informal counsel also includes radio, a book, because it's not really specific to your situation.
Mm-hmm.
Formal counsel becomes counsel that you've paid for, likely, and it's counsel that someone is actually giving you based on kind of the framework of being paid for, right? Which is fiduciary, which is legit. People don't want to get sued, right? If I'm charging you for advice, I have to follow some rules and regulations that keep me kind of in line and ethical and all those kinds of things. Well, those are two very different pieces of counsel. They're both really, really important, though. And I talk about it in the book. I don't say one's more important than the other. They're just different. And once you step back and think about them as different, you start realizing that the counsel that you get may be valuable, but you need to kind of run it through the bias filter. You know, I mean, so I think that's just incredibly important.
Is that a process that people have to dedicate a specific amount of time to? So 1 hour per week, 3 hours per month, you have to do this? Or is it more informal, both for the informal and the formal counsel?
It's more informal. And,
Okay.
and it's very problematic. And I've said this earlier, the reason it is, and this is my hypothesis, though I'm not positive I'm right on it, so people can say you're crazy, but what has happened is there's a population of people that didn't grow up with money. And just real briefly, people who grow up with money, seeking counsel is just built into their DNA. I mean, if you know a trust fund baby and they go buy a car, they literally send the lease to a lawyer. Now, I'm not saying you should do that, right? That's the extreme model. But people with really a lot of money, especially trust fund babies, they don't really do anything without someone looking at it. The family office, the financial planner, they don't buy versus lease. They don't do anything without seeking counsel, right? It's just built into their DNA. It's built into their process. It has no impact on their ego, right? So because it's just what they do. Someone who has gone from basically nothing, gone to college, worked, 80 hours a week for 10 years, is really smart. Well, all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't really need a financial advisor. He or she's telling me what I already know. Diversification, go through processes, right? So even seeking counsel for that particular group is a mindset. It's incredibly difficult to beat because it's all kind of ego. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, I don't need you. In fact, I sat down, I had a coffee, just a quick story. I had a coffee with someone who'd accumulated a ton of money, fantastic, started his own company, created a huge amount of wealth. And he does all his own stuff himself. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he says, I've sat down with 3 financial advisors and they tell me everything that I already know. And I said, that's what you want. I said, you don't want to sit down with a financial advisor that starts talking about some alternative investments or some other process. You want someone that's following the model that we know works over 100 years. But he's like, well, I don't need that because I already know it. So that's the challenge. And what I did tell him is I said, you may know it all, but order matters. And your financial advisor really is trained and usually very, very good, the better they are. It's not what they tell you to do. It's the order in which they tell you to do them. That's where you get your value from a financial advisor or seeking counsel. And you even know that in your business, right? I mean, what order do you do stuff?
Absolutely correct. Order is extremely important. And the reality is you don't want to learn things on the fly when it is most important for you to learn. So if people come to you and they go through your process, Plan Assist is there, you have the book that educates them. Where do they start? Where do they finish? Are you becoming that formal individual that is sitting in the back on their shoulder going, yes, this is a good idea. No, this is a bad idea. Or are you helping them in a different way?
It depends on the client. First of all, I put together the plan, a formal discipline plan. So think of a plan. The first plan you do may be really simple, one pager here or there, like we talked about. But at some point in your career, at some point in time, you actually want to take all that information and put it into an actual financial plan. And think of it like this. If you do an extension on your house, the first person you're probably going to talk to is an architect. And that's a fun conversation. It's fantastic. It's here's the roof line, here's the color, the size of the room, all that kind of stuff. It's very fun. Okay. Think of that as the basic plan. Here's what we're doing. It's a fun conversation. At some point, though, and all of you that have built a house know this, is that architect takes that plan and turns it over to an engineer that then puts all that information into CAD, okay, or into some software system. Well, that engineer doesn't care about what it looks like. He connects all the dots, right? So he's going to say that wall can't be that far apart without a pole in the middle. And then you're like, well, I don't want a pole in the middle. Too bad. Or you need to do steel. You need to do something. The point is what that engineer will do is connect the dots of all the plans. And that's kind of the first thing that I do, is put a formal plan together using a variety. I use Right Capital, but eMoney, there's a ton of really good financial plans there that really connect all the dots is imperative. So that's kind of step one. And then the diversification, I got some software to help them with that. But again, I think it's the best software. It's the software I use. But there's really good software out there today to help with kind of all three of with the first two steps. So think of the first two steps as pretty objective, right? I mean, it's put a plan together and be diversified. You sat down with 100 advisors, 95 of them are probably going to say the same thing.
If the first two steps are objective, that means that there's probably a way that we can identify some of the mistakes that people may run into or the pitfalls that they want to avoid. What are some of those common mistakes that people are making when it comes to their financial decision making? How can they avoid them?
So the first one's overspending, which we talked about. So living within your means is probably the single biggest one by a multiple, right? But living within your means is imperative. The second biggest mistake I see people make is they think their house is an investment. I literally have people that will get wound up with me when I do their plan and I don't have their house on their financial plan. They're like, well, my house is worth $1 million. I said, doesn't matter. You got to live someplace. That's not part of your plan. And they count that as their net worth. And the problem with that is they live based on that. You know what I mean? They buy cars, they make financial decisions, they go on vacation based on the value of their house. Most financial advisors will take the house out of the plan. So whatever you have in that house is not part of your financial plan.
So in a weird way, until you liquidate that house, it's actually a liability for you then. It's not an asset that you can plan against. Is that correct?
It's your world. A house, even until you sell it, you got to buy something else. It's basically estate planning. It's an inheritance. It's that I want to leave. When you start your plan up, you say, I want to leave my children $1 million. Okay, your house is worth $1 million. That's fine. Then you can spend all your money except no debt on your house. You've left your kids $1 million. So it's that. That's probably the second really biggest mistake that I see happen. And then the third is they do, and we touched on this earlier, they just don't max out their 401ks. They do, company matches 4%, I do 4%. No, you need to do 20,000.
Understood. All right. Let's talk about estate planning and integration. So how do the principles of your book, of your approach, integrate with comprehensive estate planning, and how does that simplify end-of-life tasks?
It all starts kind of with step one. So you kind of do everything. At the end, it will identify how all those assets are titled. If you have beneficiaries on your IRAs, your 401ks, do you have contingent beneficiaries on accounts? Even people who are pretty detailed, it's surprising as you get into your 50s, how many accounts you might have and how many of them you don't really keep up to date like you could and should for estate planning. And probably the biggest is making sure you have titles correctly and make sure you have, a good one is people will spend $10,000 to set up a trust and then they never fund it. Another one is I'll go through their beneficiaries and they have an ex-wife on their 401k, old life insurance beneficiary. That kind of stuff is probably the biggest aha. And once I take them through it once, then I go through it every couple years from that point.
That's interesting and completely correct. We were in a conversation just a week or two ago, and the story was that an individual passed away and they hadn't updated a previous employer's plan, which was still active for them, a benefit life insurance policy. And the ex-wife was the one that was designated to receive and is contractual. Fortunately, the ex-wife said, no, I don't want this money. It should go to the current wife and their kids. So it worked out okay. but having all that information in one place is unbelievably important.
And it's very easy. It goes back to order and prioritization. When I do a plan for someone, I tell them, look, if you haven't had a plan, this isn't something we do like in 1 hour. This is something we do over the course of 24 months because you can't do everything at once. It's too much. If you just sit down with some, and one of the early things you'll do is what you're talking about is estate planning. But once they get done with that, then you'll get into, okay, then let's talk about investments, or let's talk about, you can do. I find if I give them 2 to 3 to-dos, that's about the max.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. That's the max, which means that some people can get overwhelmed. For the listeners who might be feeling overwhelmed by their financial situation or estate planning, what advice do you have for them about getting started and getting on the path to making better financial decisions?
It sounds ridiculously simple, and it actually is, but it really makes a huge difference. Just list out all of your accounts and be really detailed in how are those accounts titled. And then make sure someone that understands what those titles mean, understand it. So little things like joint with rights versus tenants in common. And I notice some people are like, well, that doesn't happen. It actually happens a lot because we open these accounts online. It's a checkbox. So I would start with just a really good list of all your accounts, how they're titled. And then if you can put beneficiaries on them, I would. And in most states, you can do transfer on death or Ladybird Trust in Florida. I mean, they're not called, they're called different things, but you can actually put transfer on death in most accounts. So that would probably be my first step.
All right. Now, for people that are interested in learning a little bit more about you and the company and Plan Assist, how do they find you?
So planassist.com. I got a summary of kind of what it is. It's simple. And I am only registered in Florida and Indiana and Michigan. So you can still call me. You can download the book for free on the website. So go to the website. I mean, you can buy it on Amazon.com, but you can also download it. Like I said, it's a relatively short read.
All right. And then the last question for you, Tim, and we appreciate your time today, sharing all your wisdom. There was one thing that we should have talked about that we didn't. What is it?
I think we hit on everything. I think if I was just kind of summarizing in the end, that seeking counsel, people think it's, oh, this person's going to tell me what to do. It's not seeking counsel to have someone tell you what to do. It's seeking counsel to have someone give you an opinion that then you decide if you want to follow it or not follow it. And I think that's probably the biggest disconnect in that third step.
All right. Tim Clifford, we appreciate you coming and joining us on the Buried in Work podcast, where we feature tips and stories from industry professionals who specialize in making estate planning, end-of-life tasks, and transitions more manageable. If you're listening, we appreciate that you're here. Please give us a review on your listening service, whether that's Apple or Spotify or somewhere else altogether. We'll see you next time. It's Adam Zuckerman as your host today. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Buried in Work podcast. Remember, you can save 10% on our estate preparation package and games with code podcast10 at buriedinwork.com.